This is the Planning and Zoning Committee meeting for Wednesday, March 23rd. It's 3:31 p.m. We have one case today. The meeting is hereby called to order. Mr. Gambrell, are you going to tell us all about this?
Yes, ma'am. So you're ready? Yeah, this is Tim Gambrell. I serve as the chief planner for the city of Birmingham. And so this one item is a zoning amendment where we are proposing to create an overlay district that would create incentives and exceptions when a historic building is being redeveloped. And so the intent of the ordinance, I could just read this thing to you, but I'm just going to kind of, go off the top of my head, sort of extemporaneously here. But the intent of the ordinance is, to protect and, historic character, historic resources. Oftentimes, historic buildings, say they're built 100 years ago, prior to, a lot of automotive, a lot of parking, buildings that are built, lot line to lot line. And, so you got this historic building, somebody wants to reuse it, parking becomes an issue, potentially setbacks, potentially height, or potentially even use. We thought about certain uses that, and we can talk about the particulars as we go through, but in general, the intention of the ordinance is to create incentives and exceptions for buildings that are in that condition, because, potentially, you could imagine a situation where, there's a building, they want to redevelop it, they have all these issues with regulation, and they just say, okay, you know what, we're just going to abandon that, we're just going to tear it down, do something different. And so, that's kind of that would be like the worst case scenario, and that's sort of what we want to avoid, is old historic buildings being torn down, And so, the hope is that this ordinance would facilitate those buildings being redeveloped and reused. And so, if, I'm going to flip over to the second page where the ordinance is described or presented. And, so the intent and purpose, I think is kind of basically what I was just saying, but you will see in here, it mentions live work units, and it also mentions, some economically distressed areas, historic buildings, those kinds of things, and so the intent and purpose, is to, to foster redevelopment of those historic resources in those locations. And then you'll see where these apply. So we're creating what we're calling this adaptive reuse incentive area, which is basically, the city center as depicted. We'll depict that for you in the ordinance, but basically it's all of that part of the city that's in between roughly 12th Avenue North to 12th Avenue South from I-65 on the west, and then Red Mountain Expressway to the east with the inclusion of Lakeview District. And that's kind of what we call the city center, based on the city center plan, based on other documents that we've created, urban renewal plans and that sort of thing. So if you got a historic building within that boundary, or one that's within a revitalization district, a historic district, or an opportunity zone, or if you're a building that's outside of one of those zones, but you may be on the National Register and you're available for placement on the National Register as determined by our historic preservation officer, those buildings, could potentially be qualify for treatment, within this ordinance.
Well, may I ask a question?
Sure.
I know you're not finished, but I want to stop.
That's right.
Why are we limiting, for instance, there actually could be a historic building in some outlying part of Birmingham that was maybe annexed in or something.
Right.
Why would we limit the use of this ordinance to just ones in a certain part of town? Because, my feeling is historic buildings are almost always better built and structurally, unless they've been allowed to decay, they're better buildings. The wood you can buy now isn't even quality wood compared to old wood. So Why would we limit it?
Well, we're not. And so, yeah, and I think that's a good point. That's one of the good reasons to do, to maintain historic buildings is that you don't build things like you used to, And so that's one of the good reasons to do it. I mean, if you were to try and rebuild certain historic buildings in town today, I mean, the cost of that would be prohibitive. And that's kind of why a lot of people build the kind of stuff that they do now, because cost is so prohibitive to, high quality, building materials. So, that's one of the good reasons to do this. And so I agree, and I think we all agree with that. And so, but if you look at eligible buildings, any building that's at least 50 years of age and deemed historically significant by Birmingham's Historic Preservation Officer based on the Secretary of Interior standards for registration of properties criteria, so that's potentially an eligible building, regardless of where it's located. Any building located in a historic district, any building located individually listed on National Register, any building located in a National Register Historic District. So it goes beyond just those areas. It does include, number one, is basically any building 50 years old, that could be anywhere. And that was the intent of including that. So, but for us, the priority is the city center, revitalization, historic districts, opportunity zones, but it goes beyond that. If you are a building outside of one of those areas, you could still be eligible.
Yes. Yes.
All right, another broken mic. Okay, so you basically set this reuse zone.
Yeah.
But as long as you meet the criteria, so why are we even making a zone at all?
Well, I think it's just to kind of focus on those key areas. And I think that's principally where you'll find most of those buildings. But I think we just included that provision, kind of based on, sort of, along the lines of Councilor Abbott's comment, that, yeah, it's good to focus on these areas, but what if, there's a building otherwise? I'm guessing that most of the buildings would be captured here. Like you say, opportunity zones are included. I mean, that's like, I think it's probably 80 to 90% of the city,
Right. I guess I'm just confused at why create a zone when as long as you meet the criteria, you would qualify. Because
yeah, I understand.
Tell me that we created this zone, I would assume that nothing outside of that zone would qualify.
Yeah, I get you. Like I say, I think it's, to focus on those key areas, but, because more than likely all of those buildings will be located in there. But if one happens not to be, it's covered as well. I mean, I guess you could go, do it that way and just say any building, anywhere, in the city that meets this criteria.
But that's what it is.
I mean, it sort of does that. Yeah, it sort of does that.
It just does it in a back-assward way.
I know, it does exactly that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not,
But, like I say, I mean, the focus is on these districts. And, I mean, it doesn't have to be that way necessarily, but it makes sense to me, because it is, you're focusing on those key areas that are kind of mixed use and that are older parts of the city, the historic districts, revitalization districts, the city center. Those are kind of the key areas, I think, where you're going to find these buildings.
So could we not say that our primary focus is these areas, but that any building that qualifies, and what is the qualification? Does it have to be 50 years or older, like
right.
to be a historic building?
Yeah, the Secretary of Interior has standards, that I think they're called like historic significant buildings. And so, yeah, one of the criteria, they'd be 50 years or older. The other would be that they'd have some architectural or engineering significance. And so, that would be, and so it's called out in here that the Historic Preservation Officer would make those determinations. So somebody, there's some procedures in here, that would dictate that they would have, an applicant would have to apply, provide a certain amount of information, and then, an applicant would receive, a determination, and then there's an opportunity to make appeals to the DRC if they feel like, that determination was inaccurate.
Okay. Yeah.
And then, so in number 3 in section 2, historic significant buildings, any building determined by the City of Birmingham's Historic Preservation Officer to be eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places, or any building listed in the National Register of Place, or any contributing building in a National Historic District, or any building identified as contributing structure in a local historic district. So, once again, the Historic Preservation Officer would make that determination. And then they would have, there would be an opportunity to appeal if they felt like that determination was inaccurate. And then number 4, defines what a dwelling unit and a live work is, kind of how that's defined, because, there's a potential, when we rewrote the zoning ordinance back in 2015, we made it a clear definition or delineation, that dwelling units would not be allowed in industrial districts, but, there's a potential that an industrial building could be converted to, there's like a maker space, it's kind of this popular thing, where people are dividing industrial buildings into maker spaces. And I could see the possibility, in fact, we've been asked about it by different folks, that, if they wanted to do like a live-work kind of arrangement, you'd have a shop downstairs, somebody living above, there's some kind of artisanal, producer, maybe they're a sculptor, maybe they're a, manufacture signs or something on a small scale, where they would want to, operate in kind of that live-work arrangement. And so we created this exception here, in historic buildings, if somebody wanted to convert a historic industrial building into a live-work arrangement, that would be allowed. And typically that would not be allowed by ordinance. And so that's the definition on number 4. And then, section 3 deals with incentives, where, if there's a density issue, and of course the parking issue, off-street parking, basically, you wouldn't scrutinize them, for additional parking from what they already have, but you would want to preserve what they do have. Same with a loading space. And then this historic preservation standard, is basically, an item where they're able to scrutinize that for design review. You wouldn't necessarily want somebody to adaptively reuse a building, strip the facade off, benefit from this, and then, convert it to like glass and steel. So this creates kind of a design standard, where they would have to, if you're, say you're, adaptively reusing a historic building and you're getting some sort of tax credit from the feds or even from the state, they're scrutinized on their design. You can't do certain things and still get that credit. And so if they're doing that with the building and they're not getting the credit, we still want to maintain the historic character. And so if they're going to benefit from this ordinance, we're going to say that you have to maintain that historic quality. And so that's kind of what this historic preservation standard does.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair. Aren't there already like an approval? If you want to renovate an historic building, don't you already have to go through a process to get your designs approved?
Well, it depends. If so, in a city, if you're not in a historic district, maybe not. If you're not benefiting from a state or federal tax credit, maybe not. So I think that's kind of what this does. Is if you're not in a local historic district, if you're not, like I say, receiving a tax credit from the feds or from the state, potentially you could change the design of the building and change the historic character of the building. And so that's kind of what this does. If you're going to benefit from this ordinance, we want you to maintain that historic character.
Yeah, I guess the benefits just seem to be just like variance type stuff, like waive your.
That's true.
It doesn't seem like
you could get a variance.
I guess we're saying incentive, but I don't know that these 3 things will make me excited to go and undertake some efforts.
Maybe not. Think about that. We had that rezoning case yesterday, and the primary reason they were here is because of their parking situation. If this would have been in place, they would not have had to apply for that ordinance.
Yeah, and as a person who has a lot of historic buildings in their district, it is a big deal.
Yeah.
You know, because
Right.
you have buildings that were built before there were cars.
Right.
You know, and so nobody needed parking. The building took up the entire piece of property.
Right, and like I
And
say,
so you couldn't have any parking without ripping out the back of your building.
right, and I think that's the jeopardy that you put yourself under, that, you know, as a city, that, you know, somebody says, oh, well, I'd really like to do this, you know, I couldn't get the variance, or I couldn't get it rezoned. There are other options to tear it down, you know, and start over. You know, and I think that's kind of the fear. And it also, you know, I don't know if it's completely analogous, but, you know, this has been very successful in other cities. I know the city of Los Angeles adopted adaptive reuse ordinance about 10, 15 years ago, and it created a revolution in development in downtown LA and really changed the character there. You know, well, it didn't change the character, it created a reuse for an area of town that was unable to redevelop because of parking. They have very onerous parking standards, and it really changed the dynamic there, you know, where these buildings could be redeveloped. And so, I mean, it's been very, very popular there. I think the developers, you know, will really like this. Like I say, if you come into a situation just like Magnolia Point, you know, the Hardwick is another example. The Hardwick was in the exact same situation where, you know, they basically had to rezone their property to a district, you know, that didn't allow parking because they had no parking, and the building, you know, is lot line to lot line. Now, they're actually building parking, but, you know, based on our ordinance, you know, they may not have had the full requirement. You know, so it creates an atmosphere where, you know, the developer has flexibility, and it creates opportunity for them where, you know, they would have challenges otherwise. And, you know, it seems, you know, I mean, in our world, you know, we hear a lot of, you know, pushback on, you know, variances. People do not want to go to ZBA, you know, because you really don't know what's going to happen. You know, I mean, they have a set of standards they follow, but their decision, their quasi-judicial, their decision's final. And if, you know, to appeal that, you got to go to circuit court, you know. And so, you know, certain developers, they don't seem to mind going to get a variance. Others try to avoid it like it's the plague, you know. And so, you know, like I say, the incentive is to kind of ease restrictions that help to, you know, maintain those historic buildings and character.
No, I'm with that. I'm just trying to sort through. So it just really seems like it just clarifies the process for, unless you know exactly what you're dealing with before you purchase some property or get ready to move forward with.
Yeah, I mean, they're gonna you know, they're gonna be savvy and do their due diligence and understand what they need to deal with. And but I think this just kind of assists. You know, it just, you know, greases the, you know, cogs or whatever, if you will. You know, it makes it a little easier, you know, for them to move through the process. And oftentimes, you know, it's like those guys yesterday were talking about, you know, we've been in this process for months. You know, that's months of time that they really didn't need to spend, you know, necessarily if this was in place. You know, and that may assist them, you know, to make that project go easier, faster, you know, that kind of thing.
So I guess on these eligible building settings, like some of these say basically determined by Birmingham's historic preservation officer, but you know, if it's in a historic district, if it's on the national land, so there's appears to be 3 that are just automatic that don't require anybody else to make a determination.
Yeah, but yeah, we would still send it through that person, you know, just to verify. Yeah. And then also we'd want to scrutinize their plan, you know, to make sure that they're not doing something that we don't want them to do. You know, like I said, you know, destroy the facade or change the facade radically, you know, those kinds of things.
Or take out the windows and put vinyl ones.
Exactly, exactly.
Where is this map that it says is depicted on figure 1.08.701?
Right, I didn't include that map, but that's what I was describing before. The city center, that map is the city center. And so that's the area of downtown in between 12th Avenue North, 12th Avenue South, I-65 on the west, Red Mountain Expressway to the east, but then include Lakeview. And that's what we call the city center, you know, through urban renewal plans and through our city center master plan. That's how we've described the city center.
Okay, well, it'd be great if we could have the map.
Yeah, we will. I'm sorry. I had included one with the zoning advisory committee, and I forgot to add it here. But yeah, we will definitely. We'll have to have a map in the document. But like I say, it's basically, 12th Avenue north to south, I-65 to Red Mountain Expressway, and then we include Lakeview in that as well.
See, most new people and some old people on the council don't know where the enterprise zones are. They don't know where the opportunity zones are. They don't know where the historic districts are,
Right.
or the commercial revitalization districts. It would be good to have a map with this that shows
Yeah, we can produce that for you.
things, color-coded so that people can get a feel for what they've got in their districts or what we've got in the city. And I would would it hurt anything on the first page, item 3 under applicability? On item 3, could we just add the word focus? We could say the city council hereby establishes the following focus areas as adaptive reuse incentive areas. And then down in the next definitions, under eligible buildings, we could just say any building in the city that's at least 50 years of age, and all those other criteria can be considered, so that it doesn't sound like we're excluding any particular buildings. Because I can think of a few that are not, I don't think they're in a district, but they would be worthy of saving, and they are commercial. So it would just be good to make it clear that, yeah, we're going to focus on these designated areas, but any building in the city that qualifies as an eligible building can be considered. Just
Sure.
to make it more, comprehensive.
Yeah, I guess even if you just call it adaptive reuse incentive program, that just applies to the city. You're almost like subdividing while the subdivision doesn't actually hold any weight, because anywhere in the city you could apply for this? Or is there weight given in the director's determination process?
We're not giving any money. We're not giving away money. The incentives we're giving are to not have to go by the zoning ordinance.
That's right. That's correct. We don't have to call it an area. We could just say adaptive reuse incentive and just leave it at that.
There you go.
That's not a problem. That would be easy to do.
Yeah, I just want it to be citywide, so that anyone who has a qualified building can apply, anybody, and just make it clear that it's anybody, any building, not anybody, but any building, because we do have, Birmingham is very fortunate. If you look at a city like Atlanta, they don't have much historic anything left because they tore most of it down, whereas we still have a lot of historic buildings in Birmingham that most of them are probably worthy of saving. There's a few, that just, didn't look like much of anything, but for most of them, it would be good to give people some help.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Encouragement, I guess. We just want to encourage them to save these places instead of turning them into parking lots.
We're incentivizing them.
Yes. Yeah, we can't call it an adaptive reuse encouragement area. It just doesn't sound the same, does it? But incentive does make it sound like we're going to give them some money because...
Yeah, people think that way when they hear incentive. They think it's monetary.
Or cash.
Right. But in the zoning world, incentives typically, revolve around, additional, ability to do things, whether it's a height bonus or density bonus, those kinds of things. We have a affordable housing incentive bonus in our zoning ordinance. And if you do affordable housing to a certain percentage, you can get height and density bonuses for that.
Okay, does anybody have any questions or comments or? Well, can we make those changes?
Sure.
Is that a problem in any way?
It's not for me. Yeah, I don't think it's any issue at all.
Only 4 words, but it just, to me, it kind of loosens it up a little bit, because I was thinking we were trying to limit it to just the places in number 3 of under B.
Yep.
And I don't want I don't want anybody to think it's limited.
Yeah, it does read that way, and that is the intent, to a certain degree. But at the same time, I mean, that was a comment that I had. It's like, okay, we're going to focus on these areas, but, what if there is a building somewhere else? And so, that's why we included the definition of eligible, to include those that are outside of the district.
Well,
So-
I just like saying focus areas,
Sure.
so that it's clear that we're focusing, but we're not closing our eyes to all the other places that we might not be able to focus on because they're at the corner of our eye.
Yeah, that's not a problem with me, and I don't think it's an issue with the ordinance. I'll produce you guys some maps, so you can see, where all these other areas are. The ordinance itself will have the map, that's called out in the figure, 1.08.701, and so that map will be included in the ordinance as it's submitted to the council. But I can produce these other maps as well, just so that you can see those and kind of understand where those areas are. Like I said, the opportunity zones covers, close to 80% of the city, somewhere abouts.
Yeah.
We
were very lucky with
Yeah,
those.
we've got a lot of the designations in those tracks. And although there were certain areas we didn't get that we wanted, but, that was the call of the governor.
Well, considering the kind of focus that's usually put on Birmingham, it's usually negative. So I'm glad we got a positive focus.
I would have to agree with you, yes.
Okay, so does anyone want to make a motion regarding this adaptive reuse incentive? And
Scratch
we've
area.
gone to ARI instead of REA.
I move that we send the adaptive reuse incentive zoning overlay district ordinance forward to the full council with a recommendation of yes, pending the requested amendments.
Okay, and thank you. It has been moved and properly seconded, and Tim, I can just give you this. I mean, like I said, I only
Yeah, that's fine. I made notes.
wrote 4 words on it.
Yeah, I
so
made
it's-
some notes, but yeah, I'll take that from you if you'd like.
Okay, and if there's a better way to word it, I don't care, as long as it gives the impression to everyone that it's citywide. So we have a motion, we have a proper second. All in favor say aye. Aye. And anybody opposed? Okay, it was unanimous.
Okie dokie.
Okay, our
Incremental
next
progress.
item is old and new business. Do we have any? I don't know of any either. Well, we're to item 4, one of our favorites.
I don't say that. Something we must do. I move adjournment.
It has been moved and properly seconded. All in favor say aye. Aye. So